So here we are, and we have some interesting material to cover this evening. I thought, for starters, since we were talking about religion and God yesterday, I have this book entitled The Quotable Jung, and it's edited by Judith Harris with collaboration from Tony Woolfson, published by Princeton University Press. And I thought I would read a few of the quotes. These are from different eras of Dr. Jung's oeuvre, so they're helpful because he drops things all over the place, and then you have to read 20 volumes to find them. And so this book of quotes is very handy. And so this is the book again, The Quotable Jung. And so the first quote is from a letter to Father Victor White, dated April 10th, 1954, which is found in the Jung-White Letters, page 238. And Dr. Jung had a long correspondence and relationship, a decade-long relationship with Father White, who was a Dominican priest, and he was also the chairman of the religion department at Cambridge. And so he got very interested in Dr. Jung's work, and they corresponded quite a lot during that next 10-year period. They then had a falling out, but this is before that falling out. And there were some rather tragic aspects to Father White's death, but I'll leave it to you to look that up. You can find him on Wikipedia, Father Victor White. So here's the quote. "If you try to be literal about the doctrine, you are putting yourself aside until there is nobody left that would represent it but corpses. If, on the other hand, you truly assimilate the doctrine, you will alter it creatively by your individual understanding and thus give life to it. The life of most ideas consists in their controversial nature, i.e., that you can disagree with them even if you recognize their importance for a majority. If you fully agree with them, you could If you fully agree with them, you could replace yourself just as well by a gramophone record." Okay, that's a start. Next quote. This comes from the Visions seminar, and it's Visions notes of the seminar given 1930 to 1934, Volume 2, 1 February 1933, page 905. Quote, "By removing yourself from the dogma, you get into the world which is increasingly chaotic and primitive, in which you must find or create a new orientation. You must create a new cosmos out of the chaos into which you fall when you leave the Christian church. The church has been a cosmos, but it is no longer. We are living in chaos. Therefore, the general confusion and disorientation. We are profoundly bewildered through this experience, which we cannot put into the frame of things that we have hitherto known." Okay, the next quote is from Nietzsche's Zarathustra, notes of the seminar given 1934 to 1939, Volume 1, 13 June 1934, page 106. Nietzsche's idea is that out of that lack of order, a dancing star should be born. And then the next one is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1962, page 40. "If one fulfills the will of God, one can be sure of going the right way." And at some point in the future, we can talk about how you know that you're fulfilling the will of God. The next quote comes from Visions Notes of the Seminar given 1930 to 1934, Volume 1, 3 June 1931, page 391. It is tremendously important that people should be able to accept themselves. Otherwise, the will of God cannot be lived. They are sort of cramped or blighted. They don't really produce themselves as the whole of the creative will which is in them. They assume a better judgment than God himself, assuming that man ought to be so-and-so. In that way, they exclude many of their real qualities, with the result that they are like the apple tree that produces carrots, or the famous good tiger that eats apples, which surely is not the original meaning of God. Now, to bring forth what the original will intended is really the task of a whole lifetime, a very serious undertaking. Okay, the next quote comes from Psychology and Alchemy, 1944, Collected Works 12, paragraph 18. The paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. Hence, a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes. But their multiplication enriches because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Non-ambiguity and non-contradiction are one-sided and thus unsuited to express the incomprehensible. Okay, just look here. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate your comment. Dan's comment was, "Hi, Skip. Kudos on yesterday's video. Not always so easy to take criticism so gracefully." Well, I hope I took it gracefully. And I hope our friend took it gracefully. I presume he did. Grenade says, criticism is a chance to see from another perspective, not always a bad thing, in my opinion. Not always an easy thing to do, though. Yep, that's definitely true, as we see every day on our television screen. Okay, moving on. Okay, the next comes from Psychology and Religion, 1938-1940, collected work 11, paragraph 88. A dogma is always the result and fruit of many minds and many centuries, purified of all the oddities, shortcomings, and flaws of individual experience. But for all that, the individual experience, by its very poverty, is immediate life. The warm red blood pulsating today. It is more convincing to a seeker after truth than the best tradition. And finally, this is from The Undiscovered Self, 1957, collected work 10, paragraph 512. When, through mass rule, the individual becomes social unit number so-and-so, and the state is elevated to the supreme principle, it is only to be expected that the religious function, too, will be sucked into the maelstrom. Religion, as the careful observation and taking account of certain invisible and uncontrollable factors, is an instinctive attitude peculiar to man, and its manifestation can be followed all through human history. Its evident purpose is to maintain the psychic balance, for the natural man has an equally natural knowledge of the fact that his conscious functions may at any time be thwarted by uncontrollable happenings coming from inside as well as outside. For this reason, he has always taken care that that any difficult decisions likely to have consequences for himself and others shall be rendered safe by suitable measures of a religious nature. Offerings are made to the invisible powers, formidable blessings are pronounced, and all kinds of solemn rites are performed. So one other thing, The Undiscovered Self is published as a separate book. I don't have it right here at my fingertips, but it is a separate book, and it's almost one run-on paragraph of, I don't know, 50 or more pages. You can find it on Amazon. It's very inexpensive, but it is sort of a exegesis of Jungian thoughts that's very, very profound. I may read it at some time into video. I haven't decided yet. Dan says, eliminating the paradox eliminates the fun. What are we doing if not playing the greatest game of all? Absolutely. And so when you go to autocratic countries like Turkey or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, you don't see much fun there. So, the United States and Canada are messy, but we have a lot more fun. And other countries are in various phases between that. So anyway. So I'm going back now to our planned discussion for the evening. I'll put my little dream image up just for 3 seconds to indicate that this is where I'm starting this. And then I'm reading from this book, C.G. Jung Dreams, with a foreword by Sonu Shamdasani. And I'm reading from an essay called General Aspects of Dream Psychology, or I'm discussing General Aspects of Dream Psychology, which appears in Volume 8 of the collected works. And tonight I'm going to begin with some later material, but in order to have it in full context, I have to go back and remind you of this dream that this young man had, which I was discussing last week. It's a very short dream. So here's the dream. I was standing in a strange garden and picked an apple from a tree. I looked about cautiously to make sure that no one saw me. Okay, that's the dream. And then Dr. Jung says in paragraph 474 that he wants to talk about some other topics. I already did one session on this essay up to this point. The essay goes from paragraphs 443 of volume 8 to paragraph 529, and I am now on paragraph 474. The first topic that he takes up is the classification of dreams, and he comments that this is not very productive, and he says that typical dreams do exist, but not very frequently. And he observes in this paragraph that he has been interpreting about 1,500 to 2,000 dreams a year, and so he knows something about a broad range of dreams, presumably. And then he talks about typical motifs, and he says that's more valuable because they allow comparison to mythology. And mythology, like dogma and like the Tarot, are narratives that get passed down through many generations, and therefore they get refined and become more and more archetypal as they're told and retold. Then it says, like Nietzsche, Dr. Jung believed that dream thinking should be regarded as a phylogenetically older mode of thought than mythology. So in other words, he's saying that dreams came before any myths or any narratives were put around those dreams. And I've discussed before how my mind gets a vision of a police car anytime there's police activity anywhere near me, within 2 minutes of me in any direction. And so you can imagine our pre-human ancestors who were threatened by some predator, and they would get a flash of a vision of perhaps a tiger or something like that, and that would warn them of a predator in the area. Not that I'm saying that police are predators, mind you, but I think that my 2-million-year-old man relates to that, to those circumstances, as if the police are predators. Yes, Dodie Doe, you can ask questions, and we will try to discuss them. This is a reading group, and we are informal here, although I am trying to get through specific material at the request of some members of the group. So I am getting through material, but I will from time to time and respond to questions, and also your fellow discussants can also respond to you as well, as they will on the chat. Okay, so now we're referring back to the apple dream, which I just read to you. And he says, this is a typical way of representing erotic guilt. The thought is boiled down to, quote, I am doing wrong acting like this, unquote. And he says this message is always in the language of parable or simile. And it's characteristic of primitive languages, because primitive languages always have flowery terms of phrase, and today we speak in terms of abstractions rather than similes. And I just thought of William Shakespeare's sonnet, which begins, let me compare thee to a summer's day. And so obviously that's very flowery. But because it is more primitive in its style, it gets through to your unconscious when you hear it. Okay, so in paragraph 474, Dr. Jung comments that the body bears traces of phylogenetic development. So does the human mind. So what he's talking about here is, for example, if you look at a human fetus at a certain stage in its development, you'll see what appears to be the fetus of a fish. And later on, it might appear to be the fetus of some other creature. And ultimately, it becomes a human being by the time it gestates completely, 9 months. And so what Dr. Jung is saying is that there are traces of such events in the human mind, and this figurative language of dreams comes from an archaic mode of thought. And this raises a very significant issue that came up for me in the last week or so. I don't remember exactly because I had a complex week last week, let's put it that way. And but in any case, I was referred to a conversation between Mary Stein and Peter Kingsley, which took place in Zurich about 18 months ago, about February of 2017. And I was very surprised when I viewed that interview that Murray Stein seemed to have a lot of ennui about the Red Book. And he said, we're still trying to figure out whether we should look at the Red Book or, whether the Red Book is important to understand Jungian psychology. And many Jungians thought it shouldn't come out because they thought it was private. And it still hasn't really been incorporated into the teaching institutes for Jungian psychology. And I'm saying, what? How can this be? But then I realized, because we are doing the advanced reading group seminar on Ion, and I have read the other major books like Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Conjunctionis, Answer to Job, and so on, it finally dawned on me that what has happened is that the Jungian institutes have created a profession, which is Jungian analysis. But that profession focuses on the individual. And my interest is on society itself and how Jungian psychology relates to the individuation of societies themselves and, religions themselves. And so it occurred to me that what Dr. Jung was doing, especially when he talks about things like phylogenetic development, what he was doing was he was going back 3,500 years at least. In fact, he probably went back much farther, but the main part of his oeuvre relates to biblical times, which, let's say, goes back approximately 3,500 years, maybe a little more. Abraham lived about 1,500 years before Christ, if I understand it correctly. And it's from him that the three Abrahamic religions evolved, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so they're all coming from that original source. And so what Dr. Jung was doing was going back about 100 to 150 human generations, but trying to understand how people were expressing themselves, how they were describing their world, and that sort of thing. And, if we take my local eagle or, any four-legged beast, let's say, most of them go through a generation in 3 years or less. And, if you're born as a male cow, chances are you'll be at the slaughterhouse within 24 hours. And if you're born as a female, you'll be kept as long as you're producing milk. And but the generations go through very quickly. And so in other species, we can look at the evidence of where they came from and understand them fairly well. But for humans, you have to go back 100 or 150 generations, which means going back to the time of the Old Testament, the oldest part of the Old Testament, Genesis. And so that's what he was about. That's what Dr. Jung was about in terms of understanding how we could have the psychic epidemics of the 20th century, and how we are still having psychic epidemics throughout the world. And those, some of those have led to truly horrific genocides of various kinds. And so Dr. Jung was going back to try to understand that. And that is not an issue that is of very much interest to a clinical psychologist in the 21st century. Even if you're a Jungian, you've learned the nuts and bolts of practicing Jungian psychology. But what Murray Stein was saying there in that video sounded like some Jungian analysts have never had a religious experience, for example, which surprises me very much because, as Dr. Edinger said, guiding someone to their religious experience is a major objective of Jungian analysis. And, Dr. Jung said that in all cases over 35 that he didn't find a cure unless the person found a new religious attitude toward life. And so that experience is very important. It's essential in the 12-step programs. For example, in Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the key things is that you must have this religious awakening. And it doesn't mean any specific religion per se, but what it means is that you have to have a religious attitude toward your life and the situation in order to recover. And so that's why I often talk about my religious experiences, and I had at least 3 last week, which I won't tell you about right now, but it will be the topic of some very interesting live streams for everyone sometime in the next few months, I expect. But for now, I'll just mention that if you're new here, you should go look for my playlist called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, and there you will see some videos about my experiences, other than the ones that occurred 2 weeks ago. Okay, now, anyone have any ideas on a dream involving being lit on fire, frantic undertones? Okay, Grenade, I do not interpret other people's dreams on this channel because I'm not a mental health professional. And I regret that I urge others not to do that because you really don't know one another, and to suggest that you have an answer for someone else isn't probably appropriate. And it is appropriate for you to try to interpret your own dream. That is important. But I'd rather not do that here. So, I mean, if you do it, do-dee-do there, as you're asking this question, I would only say be cautious, because if you don't know who Grenade is, then you're really pulling it out of the wrong end of your body. Thomas says, regional Jung organizations made up of therapists, but not only therapists, have presentations on the Red Book all the time. I sense they're still in the process of working with this material. Yes, I agree with that. And they do have these sessions, Thomas. I agree with that. But here, what surprises me is that here's Murray Stein at a time which is now it was when that video was made, it was 8 years after the publication of the Red Book. And he was saying, well, do we really need another seminar or another set of essays on the Red Book? Now, mind you, he's the primary editor, the lead editor in this set, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst. And so it's very shocking to me to see him at a time just before this first volume was published, saying that he didn't really understand why we have to go back 2,000 years. But to me, it's clear as a bell why it's necessary and why one needs the Red Book in order to understand what Jung was talking about. But mind you, Jung's experience, which to me, I've thought about it quite a lot over the last 8 years. To me, the Red Book is a diary or a scientific recording of Jung's visioning process, which I consider to be comparable, and I think he considered it to be comparable to Job's experience in the Bible. So Job's experience occurred 500 years before Christ, and it got passed down generation to generation, word of mouth, so on, and finally it made its way into the Bible. But Job's experience was a visioning experience, and I would urge everyone that's watching this to go listen to my reading of Dr. Edward Edinger's book called Encounters with the Self, and I have them on the homepage of this YouTube channel highlighted, and they fall under the name of Edward Edinger's Portable Analytic Hour. And so there's part 1 and part 2. I urge you to go look at that, because he goes through William Blake's etchings of the book of Job, and it's a very powerful piece. It will take you about an hour and 15 minutes to watch both videos, and I read his books verbatim, so you don't get my opinion in there. I don't think it's much in there. So Dodi Do agrees with me that if I was to interpret, I'd probably be projecting anyway, and that's, unless you're a trained psychoanalyst, I think that's very likely. And obviously, the fire symbol is very powerful, and I think I even have a video on here that has shows of fire, and it's about people talking in tongues and the fire and so on. So fire is an important symbol, and I don't want to underestimate that. But the problem is, in every individual life, fire may have a different connotation, and unless you know a specific individual and the specific context in which that fire symbol comes up, you really can't say anything about it. That's why I commented a couple weeks ago from my book of symbols that it's really a large doorstop, because it is so complicated and it gives you so many meanings of a symbol that you still have to go back and really talk to the other person or talk to yourself. What is this symbol trying to tell me? And, I can talk about my own dream. I had a dream this morning that was very interesting, which may have been a compensation. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure what it was intending to say, unfortunately. But the dream was very simple. I was in a little rain, and I had to come down this hill on a driveway, and down near this main road where there was a mailbox, I found 2 letters on the ground, and they were they were wet, and they were piled. The two were piled over one another on the ground, and I'm not going to discuss what they represent to me, but anyway, these two letters were there on the ground in the rain, and then I opened the mailbox and found it filled with gifts and packages from Amazon and all sorts of things. And as I opened the mailbox, I kind of found myself in this room that was just filled with gifts. And I said, and so I don't know whether that's a compensation or a prognostication. And so I'll have to wait and see what future dreams I have. But it certainly does relate to my current situation, which I'm holding off discussing for the time being. So Dan says, a religious awakening involves a change in worldview. This has proven to be the only effective way to change organizations. Using rationale to convince or using motivation has not been effective. Absolutely, that's the point. And then he says, IONS, has done research on this, and it's the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dodido says, I was reading about Prometheus yesterday. I was very intrigued by the symbol of fire. Obviously, that Prometheus is an important myth. I would prefer to say narrative in the Western psyche. And the Promethean sin was bringing fire into humanity. And obviously, I'm committing the Promethean sin by putting ideas in the mind of everybody who's listening to me talk about these things. And so that's a kind of fire, and that's what a tongue of fire can be, is me talking to you and putting an idea in your mind that may have an influence on you long in the future, possibly. Thomas says, I was a member of a Jungian-led dream group, however, and it was a truly numinous experience to sit down as a close small group and brainstorm on the symbols of people's dreams. I think that that's fine. When you know the other people well, or, at least marginally, I think that's good. Here I am talking to a camera. I've never met any of you except Dan Paul I've met on video conference, but most of the rest of you I never have even seen your face. I've seen pictures of you perhaps, and so it's just not right for me, and I'm sure I could get in trouble for trying to offer mental health advice here, so that's why I try to be very careful about it. Okay, so now Dr. Jung is going back to this dream and the theft of the apple. And so in paragraph 476, he says that the theft of an apple is a typical dream motif, also a well-known mythological motif that comes up in thousands of myths and fairy tales. And he says it's one of those universally human symbols. In other words, it comes up in every culture. And then he says, quote, thus dream psychology opens the way to a general comparative psychology from which we may hope to gain the same understanding of the development structure of the human psyche as comparative anatomy has given us concerning the human body, unquote. This is a very important idea because it obviously opens up a huge area for research if you're young and college or getting ready to go to graduate school, it'd be really valuable to do research on these various topics, because there's almost none out there. The research that the scientific method guys can come up with is hooking you up to electrodes and doing an MRI of your brain and trying to take a picture of what's physically going on, but they have no way of understanding what the neurons are really doing in there and how they're firing and why they're firing and that sort of thing. Those questions are still for the future. They're still for research. And, nobody can hook you up to a machine and have your dream play up on the screen. It just doesn't work that way. Thomas says, autochthonic. Wow, that's a nice word. Yeah, it is. It's a mouthful, but anyway, it does appear in this book. Anyway, moving on. Paragraph 477. Quote, dreams convey to us in figurative language, that is, in sensuous, concrete imagery, thoughts, judgments, views, directives, tendencies, which were unconscious either because of repression or through mere lack of realization. And I want to emphasize the idea of a reflection of unconscious processes, because the way Dr. Jung thinks about these things as himself a scientist is he's thinking about the processes going on in the human psyche, and he's trying to identify those processes going all the way back to Abraham and Isaac, and probably to Adam and Eve, obviously, because we're talking about the apple here. So we're talking about all the way back to Genesis in the context of Christianity, but it also appears in every other culture. And so what Dr. Jung is working out here and has worked out over his lifetime was a rough cut version of how the psyche has developed over that time and where we are today. And he hasn't got all the answers. He knew at the end of his life, and he said in his interview in his 80s that, I don't have a final answer. And we know nothing about the psyche. And, essentially we still don't, because over the especially the last half of the 20th century, theologians and psychologists tried to suppress Dr. Jung's work, and they largely succeeded. It's now, through this group and others, since about the year 2000 especially, it's starting to come out and become popular again. And I know that Louis LaFontaine, who manages the Carl Jung Depth Psychology page on Facebook, when I joined his page, there were about 4,000 members of that page. And today, the last time I looked at it, it had over 62,500 members. So, and that's in a period between 2005 and today. So the increase in interest has gone way up. The increase in interest of this channel here has gone way up. In the last year and a half, it's gone up from about a few hundred up to 2,300, and it's growing at the rate of about 200 to 300 new subscribers every month. And so obviously the word is getting out that Dr. Jung did have something to say, that he wasn't a silly old goof, and the people that tried to write him off as a mystic simply don't know what his work was about, didn't understand his work. That's clear. And so, you have to be careful who you listen to when you hear about Dr. Jung. Thomas says, MRIs can't get to dreams, can they? Well, I think that with MRIs, they can see something going on, but by the way, I don't think you want to be in an MRI long enough for it to pick up a dream, because if you are, your brain will probably be baked in the process. I've been in MRI a few times with body parts, but not with my brain in there. And I wouldn't trust that. I mean, they have, they have done some things where they can show activity in certain parts of the brain, certainly, but that's nothing. I mean, that's no research at all into the psyche, and so that has to change. Dan says you should have a 5,000 subscriber party. Well, I'd be happy to do that, Dan, if you give me some advice about how to do it. I'm not sure I know how to do it, but I'd be happy to find a way to do it. Grenade says, fair enough, but even some of the mental health professionals give pretty bad advice at times. Jung talked about this a lot. Well, yeah, I agree with that. and what you hear at Jungian societies, like the Jung Society of Washington is an example, and it's led by very eminent Jungian analysts, but what they do is they will come in and they'll tell about some myth. I went to a very nice weekend conference on Persephone and Demeter that was conducted by Carol Pearson, I think her name is, who used to be the president of Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is one of the main places that you can study Jungian psychology in the United States. So she gives this very nice lecture on Persephone and Demeter, but she doesn't really hook it up to today's life. She tells a story, and you say, oh God, okay, that was nice way to spend a weekend, but how does that affect me? And so I've always been looking for how these things have meaning to us. I mean, my wife, who's a Buddhist lay teacher, we talk about these things quite a lot, and she says, so what does this all mean to us when we get out of the bed in the morning and lace up our shoes? What does it mean to us? And I know what it means to me, but each person has to find their own meaning and their own value. And for me, it's been partially psychotherapy. Certainly, I've talked about that before, how I have been assisted with Dr. Jung's oeuvre every time my mind gets in turmoil. If I pick up any piece of work by or about Dr. Jung and start reading it, I'm calmed down. So that's a therapeutic purpose, but also for me, it pulls a lot of things together. For example, yesterday I was talking about Jekyll and Hyde and Goethe's Faustus. Okay, well, those both came to my attention. I guess Jekyll and Hyde probably had a TV version of it before I even went to high school. And And it always weirded me out because I didn't really understand that Jekyll and Hyde were the same man, and I surely didn't understand the idea of the shadow in Jungian psychology at that time. I mean, I was probably in the 8th or 9th grade when I first saw it, so I always tended to avoid the story of Jekyll and Hyde. And the other one is Faustus, of course, and Dr. Faust by Goethe, and all the many versions of it since then. And, I've said to myself, why are we studying this thing about the devil? And I always kept it off at arm's length pretty much. But I did have an image in my mind of Mephistopheles. And as many of you know, I did have an experience with Mephistopheles, which I've described here many times. And so I now know that these things are real in the sense of real in the unconscious, in the psyche. And so now I've been able to pull those and many other strings from my life together and understand their meaning and, where I fit in the greater scheme of things. Maybe at the end of my life I'll know something more, I don't know. Dodito says, Skip, I don't want to derail the conversation because it's really interesting, but I was wondering if you could share your take on what I've read as anima possession. Well, I have no idea what you've read about anima possession, and I'm not sure I've read anything per se about that. I guess anima possession could be the henpecked husband who is afraid to stand up to his wife or to at least offer a counterpoint to his wife and just does everything his wife wants, and it's because she's behaving like his anima is expecting her to behave, and he's afraid to challenge that. I mean, that's just an off the top of my head answer, and it has nothing to do with anything I've read, so that's the best I can do at this point on that one. Thomas says, Jungian therapists are not, in my experience, dispensaries of drugs except in extreme cases. I agree with that, absolutely. Jungians would not be very interested in that, and rightfully so. And we see how psychiatrists and other types of analysts who do dispense drugs have contributed very badly to our opioid epidemic. And we need to draw ourselves back from that brink because, I find there's enough going on in my mind already. I don't need anything like a psychedelic drug to influence that in any way. And as we know from the very sad stories about various artists who are looking to clear a writer's block or a block of their creativity, and they do it by drinking or by drugs. They try to do it, and many of those people end up dead at a young age, and so I would recommend against that very strongly. Ludbomir Ekonomov, sorry, I can't pronounce your name very well, but he or she says, do you have some thoughts on Terence McKenna and his views? He described himself as Jungian, by the way. I think that Terence McKenna was an excellent guru of the late 20th century. I think he's dead now. And so there are videos about him or of him on YouTube that you can watch. I'm not sure he had quite a global or a universal understanding of Jung as we currently have. I mean, I think that when the Red Book came out, it opened up a lot of new things. I don't remember when Terence McKenna died, unfortunately, but I'm not sure he had any input on that. And I'm not well versed on his oeuvre overall. So I would just say, go back and look at his work. I know it has helped many, and it was very impressive in its day, certainly. And, see what you can learn from it. And, but he certainly had a Jungian streak in him. There's no question about that. Kurt Caban says, "Hi, would you just like to say I like your work?" Well, thank you. Thomas says, "I worry about the overprescription of such drugs as Prozac as well as opioids. Obviously, that's a big problem in our society, and it's something we all have to be cognizant of." And Grenade says, "Everyone at my college has been prescribed amphetamines. Docs hand them out like candy. That is terrible." And Thomas says, "Indeed, Grenade, Adderall." Okay. Well, I'm not very familiar with these drugs, but I would say that you have one human life, and I've had two people in my immediate, not family, but one of them was in my family, and one is in a close friend of ours who had children die in their very early 30s. And so these things are destructive of your life. And I would urge anybody that's going to experiment with it to stay away from it. And if you're going to experiment, be very, very careful. Because you can get yourself in trouble very fast. And, it's up to you. It's your life. But if you destroy it, you destroy it. And Thomas says, a question, Ray, dreaming, what happens when dreams are not taken seriously by the dreamers? Well, in my impression, most dreams, I believe that the dreaming kind of function is occurring all the time, but most of them don't have enough psychic energy behind them to get to our attention. So right now, I believe you and I and everybody else on this call and everybody else in the world is basically dreaming constantly. We basically have our psyche is performing its function of mental hygiene day in and day out, 7/24 by 365. And a lot of that function, as Dr. Jung said, and I haven't really gotten to here yet tonight, is compensation. And so that means it's a mental hygiene activity, and it probably isn't meant to be taken seriously all the time. But it's when you take your conscious mind out of the way, so you're not overwhelming it. So, like, if I were to pull my spotlight camera over here and hold it up next to my face, it would overwhelm my camera, and then you wouldn't be able to see me. And so if I'm your dream, I'd be washed out by that consciousness, by that light. And so I don't think it's essential that we pay attention, that we catch every dream. I don't think that that's essential. But sometimes they build up enough psychic energy behind them such that you have to pay attention, okay? Your psyche says you need to know this. And so I have dreams like that quite frequently. I keep a dream book. And then sometimes, even when you're awake, they crash through, and that's what's called a vision. And those visions are based on very strongly developed psychic energy behind some message that your psyche wants to get to your conscious attention. And it so happens that my vision of the police car, that probably has a hair trigger on it now, because I know that vision very well. And so therefore, when it happens, I catch it every time. And so that's it. Probably that vision is always there. It's always the same. And it probably doesn't need much psychic energy to be constellated. But something else that's more important, something like the visions of Job or Dr. Jung in the Red Book, all those types of visions do have to have psychic energy behind them. And psychic energy sometimes comes up because of a trauma. And Dr. Jung had been through the trauma of losing his relationship with his mentor, Sigmund Freud, in 1913. And he'd had a few other traumas in his life. He was going through a midlife crisis, which was when he was 38 years old. And so his psyche had a lot of psychic energy built up. And plus, he had been working as a psychiatrist already for 13 years when the Red Book period began, and he had been working in a mental institution. So he knew, he had in-depth knowledge of the psyches of all these patients. And so for him, it was very normal to, or maybe not normal, because he worried that he might be having, entering into a psychosis himself at one point. And certainly when he had his 5 visions before World War I, his precognitive visions that basically predicted World War I, and also brought to his attention the collective unconscious. When that happened, that was obviously something that had been built up in the psyches of all Europeans for years. I mean, certainly since the time of Nietzsche and before, because Nietzsche was interacting with it in his lifetime. So Thomas says, I ask because I sense among many people a tendency to disregard the value of delving into one's dreams. Is this the conscious mind denigrating the conscious mind? I think, yeah, but I think it's also fear. That, it's like me not wanting to read Faustus or not wanting to read Jekyll and Hyde as examples. We do know that, even if it's unconscious, we know that there's more in our psyche than we fully appreciate. And so I think a lot of people are afraid of their psyche, and certainly a lot of people are afraid of nightmares, and rightfully so, because they're very scary. So I don't know if it's denigrating the conscious mind, or the unconscious mind. I wasn't even conscious of a unconscious mind at the time that I started to do that. And so Thomas says, my therapist once advised me when I told her I had no dreams that I remembered to look at daylight reality as if it were a dream, something like you were saying. I think that that's a valid observation, and I think that, if you know something about projection, and let's say that you see someone in the mall or on TV, that you have a reaction about it, whether it's a love or a hate reaction, whichever it is. If you teach yourself to recognize that love or hate reaction as a projection and that's coming from you, then that can open up a lot about yourself as you think about it from your perspective. Why am I having that love or hate reaction to that person? What is it about them that I don't like? And that's a big question. Let's see. Dodido says, anima possession, maybe it's a term the authors made up. I was referring to some pieces I've read where the male is fixated with its anima. It's not just the husband who fears his wife. Well, I do recall that the book Madame Bovary is an example of anima possession, where all the men were possessed by Madame Bovary, as I understand it. I can't say I've read it recently. If I'd ever read it, I probably read a Hornbook summary of it during college, I would suppose. But I mean, that phrase could mean a lot of things, so I'm not going to go there much more than what I've said. Grenade says, it's like a dream. I am positive. Your brain constructs the reality you experience using the stimuli from the outside world. When you sleep, it still constructs in the mind's eye. Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. But without the outside stimulus, right? Kurt Caban, thanks for sharing your knowledge. I look forward to seeing more of you. And Fun Fate Tefaturua says, sorry, I have to leave you because it is time to go to bed and dream. As for me, it's 3 a.m. in France. Thank you for being here. I appreciate a lot of your sessions, and we'll listen and the end of this one later. What I would urge you to do is also join our advanced reading group, which we do conduct at 1:30 in the afternoon U.S. time. And we do have a French member and a Belgian member and a Latvian member and a Swedish member in that advanced reading group, because the time works better for them. So anyway, going on here. Okay, so one of the points that Dr. Jung is making in paragraph 477 is that the dream is not reflecting all unconscious processes. And I would guess he would mean something like, you have an unconscious process that tells your heart to beat 72 times a minute, you to breathe 12 times a minute, and so on. And all the functions of your body take place also unconsciously. And normally those aren't part of your dream. It's more your conscious ego life that has inputs and outputs from dreams, as well as dream or image material that may exist in your DNA or in your psyche, in the human psyche generally, wherever that is. And I'm not sure that anybody will ever be able to delineate where that might be in the DNA. For example, I've spoken a few times about my dinosaur dream when I was 5 or 6 years old. And I'm convinced that that dream did not come from anything that I had seen physically during my lifetime up until that point. And so I believe that it therefore came to me somehow either through the collective unconscious or through the DNA. I don't know which, and I'm not sure we'll ever figure that out. That would be a hell of a research project if somebody could figure that one out. Bernard says, sometimes I even check if I am dreaming when I think I am awake. I really check. Helps with lucid dreamings if you get into that habit. Yep, that can be useful. Easier said than done, however. Well, there's a Buddhist publication called Lion's Roar. You can find it on YouTube, and we get it here because my wife is a lay teacher of Buddhism, and in that monthly magazine this month, there is an article on lucid dreaming, which she thought was very good. It's still on our end table. I haven't read it myself, but she tried it with lucid dreaming the other day and had a thrilling experience with it. So lucid dreaming's a real thing, and you can learn to do it. Thomas says, dream interpretation is as old as Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, at least 478. I think you're talking about paragraph 478. I'm not actually up to that. I was going to read that, but I will, and also dream of Joseph and Pharaoh also. And, absolutely. I mean, so many of the things that are in the Bible are actually either dreams or visions. Now, they aren't presented to us that way when we go to Sunday school. And so I think we get misled about what Christianity is. And so one of the things I'm doing is trying to step back and say, okay, so what is Christianity actually telling us? And what does it mean? And what do all the religions actually tell us, and what do they mean? And certainly, what do they mean for the future of humanity? I think they have great importance and great meaning, but we have to work that out for ourselves. All right, so anyway, these unconscious processes are linked together associatively and selected by the conscious situation of the moment. Now, I would definitely refer you to some of the literature on neuro-linguistic programming, NLP so-called, which talks about how ideas and images in the psyche are linked together and how you can lead someone down the primrose path, or how you can hypnotize someone. I regard that as a bit of a party trick, just like I regard the tarot as a kind of party trick, but it can be quite meaningful, and in the hands of a skilled psychotherapist who uses hypnosis, it can be useful. It's been used since early in Dr. Freud's career, certainly. There was mesmerism in the late 19th century. Anyway, and so, but just to give you a sense of it, you can take any word whatsoever, and it will mean something to you that's quite different from the meaning that it is to me. And so I can say, I have a dragon mug. Okay, so here's my dragon mug. Okay, and this is quite a nice Chinese dragon mug. And, but when I said that before I held it up for you to look at, you had an idea in your mind of what my mug might look like, what color it might be, what the image of the dragon on it might be. And that was no doubt different from the image that you actually saw when I held it up in front of the camera. And so every word is like that. I can say the word yacht, and yacht is a word that is one of 12 Dutch words in the English language. And when I say the word yacht, it could mean almost anything to you. It could mean the Never Enough 64-footer that's out in front of my community in Chesapeake Harbor. And it's called Never Enough. Or it could mean a lovely, one time we had, what was it? We had a sailboat here that's 150 feet long, bright red, and what's his name? The owner of the boat has skipped my mind, but if I think of a yacht, I often think of a sailing yacht. But, even my sailfish that I used to sail when I was 12 and 13 years old, or 13 and 14 years old, that also is a yacht, because yacht in Dutch literally means small boat, but it could, your interpretation of a small boat could be like the founder of Amazon, who has a 450-foot long yacht. That could be a yacht too. And so all words are like that. And we all have anchors and neurons that fire off. And so when I said the cup, that fired off certain neurons in your mind. So you had this image, which then I spoiled by actually showing you my cup, my mug. And so now you know what Skip's mug looked like, but you still have that image that I said before I showed you the mug. And so that's the way our psyches work. And so all of us hear differently because we all have different associations with every word in the language. And so anyway, the point is that not all unconscious processes are involved, but when they are, they're linked up associatively, and then you have to come around to what they mean for you. And so Dr. Jung is saying, to interpret a dream correctly, you must know about the current conscious situation. The dream contains the unconscious complement of that. So this is why I say it's going on all the time, because whatever the current conscious situation is, there's a compensation or a complement to that in your unconscious that's also playing, because we have no thoughts without psychic energy. So psychic energy comes up from these opposites. And so if you're thinking of Skip's mug, okay, then there's something going on in your psyche that also is creating an energy pattern there. So you have to know what's the current situation, and you have to know who you are and who you think I am. I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but anyway. And without this knowledge, interpretation is impossible. This is what Jung finally said. Okay, now I'm going to go over to paragraph 478, which Thomas rightly indicated is significant. And I guess, okay. No, not even up to Nebuchadnezzar yet. This is an earlier dream, but this is one of those sections that I want to read completely because it is pretty complex, and I don't want to just synopsize it and cut it to pieces. So paragraph 478. A man once came to me for a first consultation. He told me that he was engaged in all sorts of learned pursuits and was also interested in psychoanalysis from a literary point of view. He was in the best of health, he said, and was not to be considered in any sense a patient. He was merely pursuing his psychoanalytic interests. He was very comfortably off and had plenty of time to devote himself to his pursuits. He wanted to make my acquaintance in order to be inducted by me into the theoretical secrets of analysis. He admitted it must be very boring for me to have to do with a normal person, since I must certainly find mad people much more interesting. He had written to me a few days before to ask when I could see him. In the course of the conversation, we soon came to the question of dreams. I thereupon asked him whether he had had a dream the night before he visited me. Now, interestingly, up until this point in this paragraph, this exactly parallels an interaction I had with James Hollis over at the Jung Society of Washington, but I was looking to see how to connect up his work with my work. That didn't really work out, but in any case, I don't think he didn't ask me about a dream, and I was only talking to him about nuts and bolts. So I thereupon asked him whether he had had a dream the night before he visited me. He affirmed this and told me the following dream. I was in a bare room. A sort of nurse received me and wanted me to sit at a table on which stood a bottle of fermented milk, which I was supposed to drink. I wanted to go to Dr. Jung, but the nurse told me that I was in a hospital and that Dr. Jung had no time to receive me. Paragraph 479. It is clear, even from the manifest content of the dream, that the anticipated visit to me had somehow constellated his unconscious. He gave the following associations. Bare room, a sort of frosty reception room, as in an official building, or the waiting room in a hospital. I was never in a hospital as a patient. Nurse. She looked repulsive. She was cross-eyed. That reminds me of a fortune teller and palmist who I once visited to have my fortune told. Once I was sick and had a deaconess as a nurse. Bottled fermented milk. Fermented milk is nauseating. I cannot drink it. My wife is always drinking it, and I make fun of her for this because she is obsessed with the idea that one must always be doing something for one's health. I remember I was once in a sanatorium. My nerves were not so good, and there I had to drink fermented milk. Paragraph 480. At this point, I interrupted him with the indiscreet question, had his neurosis entirely disappeared since then? He tried to worm out of it, but finally had to admit that he still had his neurosis and that actually his wife had for a long time been urging him to consult me. But he certainly didn't feel so nervous that he had to consult me on that account. He was, after all, not mad, and I treated only mad people. It was merely that he was interested in learning about my psychological theories, etc. Okay, so the point is that this fellow was actually trying to hide from his therapist, the reason why he was there. And so he falsified his situation, and he thought he should talk to a psychologist or a philosopher, and the dream forced him to tell the truth. And so in 482, Dr. Jung says that rectifies the situation and forces him into a better attitude about why he's there. And then he says, okay, 483, all dreams are compensatory to the content of consciousness, but not always so clear. Dreams contribute to the self-regulation of the psyche by automatically bringing up everything that is repressed or neglected or unknown. Remember, quote, every man, in a sense, represents the whole of humanity and its history. What was possible in the history of mankind at large is also possible on a small scale in every individual. So, unquote. So much for the idea that it can't happen here. Quote, what mankind has needed may eventually be needed by every individual, unquote. So religious compensations play a great role in dreams, a consequence of prevailing materialism to our current outlook. Okay, so then now I'm finally to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which is paragraph 484 that I thought I should read to you verbatim. And so it begins with a comment by Dr. Jung. Lest it be thought that the compensatory significance of dreams is a new discovery or has simply been made up to suit the convenience of interpretation, I shall cite a very old and well-known example which can be found in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, verses 10 through 16 from the American version. When Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power, he had the following dream, quote, I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. Okay. So, paragraph 485, in the second part of the dream, the tree becomes personified, so that it is easy to see that the great tree is the dreaming king himself. Daniel interprets the dream in this sense. Its meaning is obviously an attempt to compensate the king's megalomania, which, according to the story, developed into a real psychosis. To interpret the dream process as compensatory is, in my view, entirely consistent with the nature of the biological process in general. Okay. So anyway, then in paragraph 486, we get into this idea of nightmares and highly effective emotional situations, and much psychic energy builds it up. And so in Jungian psychology, I think it's fair to say that whenever they're using the term affect or affective, they mean emotional or something that comes out in an emotional way. And so what he says later on about this dream, which I don't have it right in front of me at this moment, but what he says later on is that Nebuchadnezzar's psyche had decided that he had flown too close to the sun. It's sort of a Icarus type of idea where his psyche was trying to cut him down or get him down to real proportions and real human proportions. And Dr. Jung is saying that it's wrong to talk about sleep preserving or affect disguising function, which is something that Freud talked about. And he says that the same is true of sexual fantasies. These are things that people dream, but they don't necessarily mean what Freud thought they meant. And he says these are direct communications. They're sending a message to you, especially these highly emotional dreams. And so in 487, he says Freud's wish-fulfilling and sleep-preserving is too narrow. The basic thought of biological function is correct. Dr. Jung's view, chief function is relation to conscious life. It's compensatory to the conscious situation of the moment. And so Dr. Jung feels that that's the way most dreams work, and most dreams we don't even notice because they're just regulating our psychic well-being. So in 488, he says as early as 1907, he pointed out the compensatory relation between consciousness and split-off complexes, and he emphasized their purposive nature, and purposive unconscious impulses became evident. So what Dr. Jung is saying is that dreams have a purpose when they get so much psychic energy up that you notice them or remember them. And then he says, but the final orientation of the unconscious does not run parallel with our conscious intentions. And so I think this is the point with the Nebuchadnezzar dream. So I'll read that again. But the final orientation of the unconscious does not run parallel with our conscious intention. So obviously the conscious intention of Nebuchadnezzar was not to have his rule come to an end. And so, quote, unconscious content contrasts strikingly with the conscious material, particularly when the conscious attitude tends to too exclusively in a direction that would threaten the vital needs of the individual. And so, maybe Nebuchadnezzar was overreaching. And what he says is here, the more one-sided the conscious attitude, the further it deviates from the optimum, the greater the possibility of vivid dreams, expression of self-regulation of the psyche. So the farther your conscious attitude gets away from where you really are, yourself really is, it's going to build up this psychic energy. Just as a physical body reacts to injuries or infections, the psychic functions react to unnatural or dangerous disturbances with purposive defense mechanisms. And so the dream serves as a warning. It supplies to consciousness in symbolic form sufficient energy to spring forth if needed. And for a dream like that, analysis is needed or it doesn't do much. So obviously some of these dreams are so complex that we really can't hope to interpret them only on our own. So let me go back here. So Lubomir says, psychedelics in some cultures are a continuation of reality, journey in the spiritual. Everybody has limits, but not trying some of the drugs, study them at least for ones just out of fear of unknown. I think that that's very wise. And, obviously, as we see, as we see people who are drunken, for example, alcoholically drunken, they lose their inhibitions, and sometimes they can get you into heap big trouble, as we've seen this week. Grenade says, I've tried psychedelics, mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, and even DMT. I have concluded that they are interesting, but far too destabilizing for long-term use. Also, I would highly recommend caution. These things are not toys. One runs the risk of losing it if they treat them as such. They certainly are not for everybody. And Lubomir, yes, indeed, they are not toys. However, not trying them at least once in a lifetime just out of fear is very narrowing view, or to stay virgin whole life just because of fear. Grenade, fear and comfort both have their healthy place. Well, I've enjoyed some whiskey, and I've enjoyed some beer, and I only once took a puff of a marijuana cigarette, which obviously wasn't enough to do much of anything. It turns out one of the reasons I have this gravelly voice is I had asthma as a child, which had to do with my father and mother's smoking, among other things. But it sort of put me off smoking anything, so therefore I never wanted to try marijuana, because I thought even tobacco was heinous. And in the case of my grandfather, who was an alcoholic, I watched him have a stroke when he was 58 years old, and he was then debilitated for the next 10 years, and he died when he was 68. And so I was privy to all of that, and having seen those consequences, I never really wanted to bring that down on myself. And so far, I'm just going to have my 72nd birthday this Friday, and so far I've managed to avoid those pitfalls that killed my grandfather at a young age. And the other thing I would observe is that we killed 62,000 people in the United States only on opioid epidemic last year, and that's 4,000 more people than we killed in the entire Vietnam War. And so by this time, everyone in the United States has been touched by someone who's died in this epidemic. And I think we all have to be sobered and rethink what our attitude is toward psychedelics or any other junk that you might want to put in your lungs or your body. And Thomas says, fellow Libra, yes, I am certainly a Libra. Okay, so how are we doing here? Okay, we still have a little time left. Okay. So then Dr. Jung goes on here. And through with. So anyway, the point is, the more one-sided the conscious attitude, the further it deviates from the optimum, and the greater the possibility for vivid dreams and expression of self-regulation of the psyche. So just as the physical body reacts to injuries and infections, psychic functions react to unnatural or dangerous disturbances with purposive defense mechanisms. Dreams serve as a warning, supplies to the unconsciousness in symbolic form, supplies to consciousness in symbolic form, sufficient energy to spring forth if needed, and analysis is needed if it doesn't do much. Okay, I guess I read that. So paragraph 489, processes of psychic compensation are very individual in nature. It makes proving their compensatory nature more difficult. And one other caveat that Dr. Jung has is beware of the influence of type, of your psychological type. You can think of it in terms of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. You cannot assume that a pessimistic attitude to life must have very cheerful and optimistic dreams, because that depends on your psychological type too. So obviously we're talking about a lot of parameters being put into here. So we just added the 16 different personality types that are contained in the MBTI, and how, it's different strokes for different folks, how the dream is compensatory, and so you have to know all these things. Paragraph 490, character is always bound up in the whole nature of the individual. The possibilities of compensation are innumerable. Paragraph 491, no one claims that the compensation is the whole story, just as complicated or unfathomable as phenomena of consciousness. So, and just remember, these are psychic processes. So we have a lot of things going on in our psyche and around our dreams, and so it just depends. So according to the consensus omnium, which is the general belief of all, I think, is what Dr. Jung is saying by consensus omnium, dreams are regarded as a truth-telling organism, always a grain of truth in such ideas, and Mater stresses prospective final significance of dreams as a purposive unconscious function. So if you only get a little part of a dream, you might not have figured out what its purpose is. And so you have to look at a series of dreams before you can be really sure. And it paves the way for a solution of real conflicts And one excellent example of this is The Christmas Carol I think it's by Charles Dickens, where Ebenezer Scrooge has a number of compensatory dreams, something like Nebuchadnezzar, which tell him that he's not doing the right thing, and then he changes at the end of the story. But I always, in my youth, found that story also weirded me out. And, so you have to be a certain age, I think, before you can start to read these things and appreciate what they're saying to you. Because if you don't, you have them in your psyche, and they can be terribly frightening. And to this day, I don't like to go to horror movies, for example. I say, why do I want to put that into my mind? I've lost the thread here. We've gotten to the point where the chat is going too fast for me to keep up. So let me just read part. Thomas says, the possibilities of compensation are innumerable, almost inexhaustible, but that with experience, certain things crystallize. I love it that it makes a point of not reducing these things down. Sean, the books I ran across always seemed to have footnotes with translations of that Latin and sometimes Greek stuff. And Sean says, same. It kind of has an exploration factor to it by always discovering something new. And I think that Dr. Jung felt that people in his time were not ready to hear a lot of the things that he was saying. And particularly in his later work, he did use a fair amount of Latin and Greek. And so he was writing to a very specific audience that was mature enough to understand what he was saying. And so, anyway, I have here that I want to also read to you paragraph 492 to 494, at least the first sentence of 494. So paragraph 492, I should like to distinguish between the prospective function of dreams and their compensatory function. The latter means that the unconscious, considered as relative to consciousness, adds to the conscious situation all those elements from the previous day which remained subliminal because of repression or because they were simply too feeble to reach consciousness. This compensation, in the sense of being a self-regulation of the psychic organism, must be called purposive. The prospective function, on the other hand, is an anticipation in the unconscious of future conscious achievements, something like a preliminary exercise or sketch or a plan roughed out in advance. Its symbolic content sometimes outlines the solution of a conflict, excellent examples of this being given by Mater. The occurrence of the prospective dreams cannot be denied. It would be wrong to call them prophetic because at the bottom they are no more prophetic than a medical diagnosis or a weather forecast. They are merely an anticipatory combination of probabilities which may coincide with the actual behavior or things but need not necessarily agree in every detail. Only in the latter case can we speak of prophecy. That the prospective function of dreams is sometimes greatly superior to the combinations we can consciously foresee is not surprising, since a dream results from the fusion of subliminal elements and is thus a combination of all the perceptions, thoughts, and feelings which consciousness has not registered because of their feeble accentuation. In addition, dreams can rely on subliminal memory traces that are no longer able to influence consciousness effectively. With regard to prognosis, therefore, dreams are often in a much more favorable position than consciousness. Although the perspective function is, in my view, an essential characteristic of dreams, one would do well not to overestimate this function, for one might easily be led to suppose that the dream is a kind of psychopomp, which, because of its superior knowledge, infallibly guides life in the right direction. Okay, so a dream, what he's saying here is, a dream isn't infallibly guiding you on. You still have to make a conscious decision. And that's true of all information from the psyche. Remember, it's coming in two streams out of your psyche, and it's up to you to decide for the right side. And it is equally a great danger that anyone who is constantly preoccupied with dream analysis will overestimate the significance of the unconscious for real life. But judging from all previous experience, we do have a right to assume that the importance of the unconscious is about equal to that of consciousness. Okay, so that's a lot more attention than most would give to it, I think. And so further in paragraph 494, often dreams contribute only to the merest fragment to the conscious situation, so that's an issue. Only if there is an obviously unsatisfactory and defective conscious attitude have we a right to allow the unconscious a higher value. And the individual is conditioned by himself and by his collective relationships, so it just depends on who you are. And if adequate, dreams have a compensatory function, and it gives dreams a compensatory function in the self-regulation of the psychic organism. So this is what Dr. Jung is emphasizing, that in most cases the dream is a compensation, and the other side of the conscious attitude, which is keeping your psychic energy running at all times, but occasionally then it can get prospective, and obviously the dreams or visions that Dr. Jung had before World War I were definitely precognitive, and they were definitely visions that involved the collective, not him personally, which gave him great relief when he realized that. Do you know anything about Carl Jung's father? Was he also brilliant, or was Carl an outlier? And Thomas says, I think he was a minister. Sean says, that's very interesting. Thomas says, small town Swiss Reformed pastor, I read. Sean says, I like the Jungian tuning that he did to Freud's ideas of dreaming. Okay, let's talk about Dr. Jung's life situation. His father was a Swiss Reformed pastor. He came down on his mother's side from, he had many uncles who were pastors, and so he had a long tradition of religious people in his background. And his father was a very unhappy man, who ultimately died young. I think he died before age 50. And he was, he had lost his faith. And so here he is as a Reformed pastor, and he's lost his faith. And so, and then Jung's mother was getting into some of the divination methods that were being used at the end of the 19th century. And so she was a psychic. You know, we still have people selling that kind of jazz on the internet and everywhere. And so she was, you know, a bit weird. But anyway, Dr. Jung's father died when he was 24 years old, and his mother's comment to him was, "He died in time for you." And so basically she meant that Jung had become the man of the house, whatever that means. And so he did have a lot of psychic stress in his youth. That's definitely true. And he had this vision when he was 12 years old, 11 years old, where he was, he could feel the vision coming on, and he knew it was going to be bad, and he didn't want to have the vision, so he held it off. He consciously prevented himself from having this vision for 3 days, but finally it just became too strong for him, and he had to let it come. And the vision was that he was looking at the Cathedral of Bern, which had just been rebuilt and had a new roof on it, a new copper roof on it. And the vision he had was of God in heaven taking a mighty dump on the Cathedral of Bern and destroying it. And so that had all kinds of symbolic meaning to him. But he said that it was a great relief to him when he allowed that vision to come. And you can see that vision in Memory Streams Reflections. It's discussed. So Lubomir says, to remain pure and sober, but didn't Jung make a lot of self-inflicted madness in order to explore the initial alchemy, meaning some kind of self-inflicted madness in order to see beyond? I don't think the alchemy had to do with madness per se, but his active imagination during the Red Book period was certainly a experiment in the depths, which he at that time didn't really have a handle on what was going on. And so it was allowing himself to explore those aspects of himself. And so you can read that in the Red Book. I've read several of the chapters, of the beginning chapters of the Red Book, onto this channel, and you can find a playlist on the homepage of this channel, so you can hear just from an auditory point of view what he was experiencing at that time. And he was experiencing psychogenic entities who were talking with him. And one of the reasons that I got so into this was that I had a very similar experience in 1993. I did not have the benefit of being a psychiatrist when this occurred to me, and it was an experience that went on for 8 months. Dr. Jung kept his going, consciously kept his going for 5 years, but in my case, my experience went on for 8 months, and I weathered it myself. I had a strong enough ego and so on to weather it myself, and it emerged as a novel. But I really didn't know what it meant when it was finished, and people seemed to like this novel, but I didn't know what it meant, and so I put it in my drawer for 21 years, and it had certain, putting it kindly, erotic aspects to it, and so when the Red Book came out in 2009, I was very excited because I said, wow, this is what happened to Jung himself. And so then I could put my experience in the context of what happened to Dr. Jung during the Red Book period. And that, helped me quite a bit to understand what had been going on with Dr. Jung at that time. And Thomas says, precognitive dreams can't be induced, can they? Was there something that made Jung a fertile field for those sorts of dreams, I wonder? I think Dr. Jung was very intuitive, and he was right in the middle of Europe. God knows what he was reading in the newspaper in those days, but there was a lot of stuff going on, obviously, because it cooked up World War I. And so, a lot of things were happening. He was going through his midlife crisis. He had broken with Freud. He was extremely intuitive. And all those things converged on him to produce those 5 visions that occurred from November of 1913 on into July. I think the last one was July 14th, 1914. And of course, World War I broke out on August 1st. And Dr. Jung was at that time in Aberdeen, Scotland, because he was giving a lecture there. And he said when he saw the newspaper about the outbreak of the war, he was the happiest man on the planet because he realized that his visions weren't only about him, that they were collective visions. And so, but I don't think that they can be induced per se. I think that if you're intuitive or you develop your intuition, you may be able to know things that others can't know from their own ideas. Obviously, I think I know a few things, but I'm sort of trying to be good and not talk about those predictions. Granat says, you think the future can affect the past? Well, surely it can, Granat, because, I actually don't want to talk about why I know that it can, but suffice it to say, during his lifetime, I thought of my paternal grandfather as Willie Loman from Eugene O'Neill's play The Death of a Salesman, and he was an alcoholic, and he had the stroke when he was 58 years old, and I thought of him as having had a very sad life and a life that had been ruined by the crash of 1929 because of experiences that I've had in the last decade. I now see him as a very heroic figure, and exactly why I would say that I'm going to withhold for the time being, but I definitely think that he was a heroic figure now, and I'm here because of the heroic things that he did to pull himself together. So anyway, that's a little tidbit in advance, but I'm not I'm not going there yet. So Sean says, laugh out loud, his mother was a character. Yes, she was. And he says, oh, I remember reading that. I actually, I've lost that one. I'm thinking of someone's book. Thomas says, there would have to be something in the present, a zeitgeist, national inklings, whatever, that brings out the precognition, visions, or dreams of stuff that happens further down the time road. Time is indeed illusory, says Andy Oxide. Check out Dean Radin, Retrocausality. And Dodido says, I'm speechless about the vision of God in the church. Weird. And yeah, that was an attention getter when I read that one too. Grenade says, fascinating concept, but outside the realm of science. I've always wondered about retrocausality. We'll look into Dean Radin. And he says, many peer-reviewed studies have proven the reality of retrocausality. How we interpret the reality is up to us, hopefully. And Sale Hayton, Andy Oxide mentioned Sale Hayton. I guess that's a name. Can you recommend good reads about retrocausality? And then Thomas says, drugs, there's a letter of Jung's from 1954 where he discussed Aldous Huxley and his attitude toward LSD and mescaline. It's findable. My favorite lines from this letter are, you have not finished with the conscious side yet. Why should you expect more from the unconscious? Which is a cogent point, okay. I think we can dig a few more things out of our unconscious, though. Andy says the quantum theory predicts that the future might be influencing the past, and Google that. It won't let me post direct links. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I think we have to wrap up here. And how much? I mean, we still have like 30 major paragraphs to go, and I'm going to call this particular meeting to a halt, and I will continue to work with this essay next week, and also with your comments as well. And if you are in the advanced reading group, we'll be doing the second half of chapter 10 on Wednesday at 1:30, which is our normal reading group time. That's 1:30 Eastern U.S. time. And if you're not a member of our advanced reading group and would like to join, send me an email at skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will get you into the advanced reading group. At this point, we've had 18 seminar sessions so far on ION. They've all been video recorded, but they are in a separate Dropbox, and they are available. So in other words, if you missed this seminar from the beginning, you can go back and catch yourself up at your own speed. And so anyway, thanks, Thomas, I appreciate that. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Dodido. So we'll continue next week. I'm sorry, by the time I've been talking for 2 hours plus, my throat starts to die, and I need to take a break. But anyway, I don't mind doing it, and this is actually the 97th meeting of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group, believe it or not. So we're working up toward 100. And oh, by the way, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to go on with this particular essay next week. I have to think about that because next week we will be having a live session again with my local group. We agreed to meet on October the 8th, so that's 1 week from today. And so we'll be broadcast live. It probably will not be the continuation of this essay next week because we normally have other things to talk about in our session together. We normally have at least 4 of us present, and every meeting up until about meeting 70 was conducted at Sammy's Italian Pizza Kitchen here in Annapolis. And so if you are in the Washington, Annapolis area, you're welcome to join us. We will be there starting to broadcast at 8 o'clock, so I usually get there about 7. And we will be broadcasting live, but we probably won't be talking about the end part of this particular essay. And so I will try to announce what we'll be talking about next week on this particular link. So if you keep this link, then you'll be able to see it. And yeah, Dodido asked for my email again. It's skip.conover, CONOVER, @gmail.com. And you can find it in the closing credits of all the shorter videos on this channel. It isn't on these live stream ones because I don't produce the live stream ones, so I can't put the closing credits on the live streams. So anyway, Leo Bemir says, check modern physics retro causality about this time thing, by the way. Okay, well, that may not be for me. I'm trying to keep my focus on Dr. Jung's oeuvre, which is in itself overwhelming, but I hope that others, as interest grabs them, will do that. And maybe you can tell us what it means to us. And certainly you can tell us on video conference on the advanced reading group, which we do as video conference on Zoom. So anyway, peace. Thank you very much for joining me tonight. And I'm going to terminate this session. So thank you for being here.